The conference room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the low, dismissive laugh of her father that seemed to linger against the glass walls. She had always known this moment would come, not because she wanted it to, because she had been preparing for it for a very long time. Nearly 4 years of building something no one in her family believed she was capable of. Nearly 4 years of sitting through family dinners, where every serious conversation ended with the same patronizing smile and the same quiet dismissal. Let the experienced people handle this. Let the professionals talk. You focus on your little career. But even she had not expected the truth to surface like this. Not here, not like this. Her parents, Daniel and Veronica Hale, had built Hale Microsystems more than 2 decades earlier. What started as a tiny workshop operation had eventually grown into a respected manufacturer of precision electronic components used in advanced engineering systems. For many years, they had been considered untouchable in their segment, but the past several years had changed everything. Global competitors had begun undercutting prices. Innovation inside the company had slowed to a crawl. Several aggressive expansion decisions had quietly turned into expensive mistakes. 1 bad quarter became 3. 3 became a pattern. Cash reserves began disappearing faster than anyone wanted to admit. She was their only child, their daughter, Olivia, the one they often described as brilliant but impractical. According to them, her degrees in quantitative economics and statistical modeling had no real application in the real business world. After graduating, she had accepted what her mother liked to call a modest position at a small financial advisory firm in a large East Coast city. What they did not know was that she had not joined as a junior employee. She had negotiated equity. And during the past few years, she had been making a series of extremely disciplined investment decisions. Starting with her initial compensation package and a small block of early participation shares, she had slowly built something significant. Something very significant. The emergency meeting had been scheduled because Hale Microsystems was approaching a breaking point. Credit facilities were nearly exhausted. 2 long-term partners had withdrawn contracts after repeated delays. Legal advisors were already preparing contingency plans in case restructuring became unavoidable within the next few months. The meeting had already been underway for almost 3 hours before she entered. She had done that intentionally. She slipped quietly into a chair near the end of the table, saying nothing. Her mother noticed immediately. "Olivia, what are you doing here? This is a restricted executive session." "I was asked to attend," she answered calmly. Her father gave a short, amused laugh. "Asked? This isn't a spectator situation. We're discussing survival decisions here." "I understand that," she replied evenly. "Do you?" her mother said sharply. "We're talking about layered debt restructuring, capital conversion strategies, and instruments you probably haven't even heard of. This isn't something you skim articles about." Olivia simply opened her laptop without responding. Around the table, several directors avoided eye contact. Most of them already understood why she was there. The chair of the board had personally insisted she be present. Her parents were the only ones unaware. Martin Keller, the company's finance director, tried to intervene. "Daniel, Veronica, perhaps we should continue with the restructuring discussion." "In a moment," her father said, eyes still fixed on Olivia. "Olivia, I know you probably mean well, but this really isn't the place. These discussions involve extremely sensitive financial exposure." "I'm familiar with the exposure," she answered quietly. Revenue decline of just under 40% over the last few years, negative operating margins exceeding $15 million in the most recent reporting period. At the current expenditure rate, liquidity lasts perhaps 10 weeks. The room froze. Her mother's expression hardened. "Where exactly did you get those figures?" "From the preliminary internal statements." She reviewed them several days earlier. "Those documents are restricted," her father said sharply. "Who gave you access to that information?" The chairman, Edward Grant, one of the company's earliest backers, cleared his throat carefully. "Daniel? Veronica. I believe we should clarify—" "No, this is completely inappropriate," her mother interrupted. "Olivia, I don't know what you think you're doing, but this meeting is not for you. You need to step out." She did not move. "I am entitled to be here." Her father smiled again, that same dismissive expression she had seen since childhood whenever she spoke about markets, strategy, or risk. "Entitled? Olivia, you don't hold equity here. You're not part of governance. Someone clearly misinformed you." Edward spoke quietly. "She currently controls 45% of the company. The The sentence seemed to hang in the air. Her mother slowly turned. "I'm sorry. What did you just say?" Olivia has accumulated approximately 45% of Hale Microsystems over the past year. She has been the largest individual stakeholder for several months now. Her father's face shifted from confusion to disbelief, then to anger. "That's not possible. Those shares aren't publicly traded. Any transfers require approval." The acquisitions came from the employee participation pool and from several directors who chose to exit their positions, Edward explained calmly. All transactions were conducted legally, independently negotiated, fully registered through the appropriate regulatory channels, and every document had been verified. The first crack in her parents' certainty did not come from the numbers. It came from doubt. "This is absurd," Veronica said. But the confidence that usually defined her voice was no longer there. "Olivia doesn't have access to that kind of capital. Do you even understand what 45% of this company represents? Based on your most recent internal valuation, roughly 400 million, Olivia answered calmly. Then she paused slightly. Although that estimate was optimistic, based on current performance trends, the realistic value is probably closer to 300 million, which would mean she overpaid by nearly 100 million. The silence that followed felt suffocating. Martin was already staring at his screen, rapidly pulling up filings. "He's correct," he muttered. "Everything is documented here. How did this go unnoticed?" "Because the acquisitions were structured through multiple holding entities," Olivia explained. "Everything was disclosed properly. But connecting them required looking beyond surface ownership records." Her father suddenly pushed his chair back, the sound cutting sharply through the room. "This is some kind of performance," he said. "Olivia, what exactly do you think you're doing?" "No performance," she answered. She was simply acting as an investor, and more importantly, a concerned one. The company was in critical condition. "She probably can't even interpret a financial statement," Daniel said, turning toward the other directors as if searching for agreement. His voice was losing its composure now. "She's 29 years old. She works in some entry-level finance role." "She's a senior equity partner at Meridian Crest Capital," Edward interrupted quietly. "She has been directing their advanced technology portfolio for over 2 years. Her division delivered returns exceeding 40% last year." Veronica's face lost color. "That can't be right. We would have known. You would have told us." Olivia looked at her calmly. "Why? So it could be dismissed like everything else she had ever accomplished? So she could once again be told she didn't understand how the real world worked? So her career could be reduced to something small and irrelevant? "Don't speak to us like that," Veronica snapped. But now there was strain behind the anger. "Then don't reduce me in front of a boardroom," Olivia answered evenly. She reminded them she was present as an investor, and in fact, now the controlling one. Earlier that same day, she had finalized an agreement to purchase an additional 7% from another exiting director. She gave a small nod toward a man at the far end of the table who suddenly found his papers very interesting. That brought her position to 52%, majority control. The reaction was immediate. Several directors began speaking over each other. Martin resumed typing urgently. Her parents simply stared as if trying to reconcile two completely different versions of the same person. Edward finally struck the table lightly. "Let's restore order. Everyone, please. We need to approach this logically." "There's nothing logical about this," Daniel said. His voice was quieter now, but far more dangerous. If this is accurate, and he was not saying he accepted it yet, but if it was, then what exactly did she think she intended to do? Walk in and rescue the company? Olivia did not hesitate. She intended to approve the restructuring proposal Edward had prepared, the very proposal they had been preparing to reject. Veronica turned sharply. "What proposal?" Edward slid a document forward. One of Meridian Crest Capital's funds had offered a capital injection of approximately 180 million. The funding would allow modernization of production infrastructure, restoration of suspended research initiatives, and recruitment of experienced operational leadership. In exchange, the fund would receive a convertible structure allowing their ownership to increase to roughly 60% if performance recovery targets were not achieved. "Absolutely not," Daniel said instantly. They were not going to reduce themselves to minority owners inside their own company. "You are already minority holders," Olivia replied calmly. As of this morning, she controlled the majority. "This is hostile control," Veronica said, her voice shaking now. "You're trying to take what we built," she corrected her gently. She was trying to prevent its collapse. If insolvency proceedings began, everything would disappear. The company would be broken apart, the brand sold. More than 200 employees would lose stability. This path allowed survival and recovery. "Under your authority," Daniel said coldly. "Under accountable management," she corrected. She intended to vote to retain Edward as chairman. She intended to appoint an experienced external executive as CEO. She intended to establish a governance committee that would actually enforce operational discipline. "And us?" Veronica asked quietly. Olivia met her eyes. They would remain directors. Their compensation would be adjusted to market standards, and they would have something more important than titles. They would see the company they created continue to exist, instead of watching it disappear. "This is insanity," Daniel said. He was pacing now, running a hand through his hair, his voice caught somewhere between anger and disbelief. "You're 29 years old." The room no longer looked at her like she was a daughter. Now they were looking at her like she was a threat. Daniel was the first to speak again, his voice tight with disbelief. "You've been working professionally for what, 6 years? And we're supposed to believe you control hundreds of millions and decided to risk it on a declining manufacturing business?" Olivia didn't react to the tone. As of the last reporting period, she oversaw roughly $650 million in direct assets, she answered calmly. That didn't include the multi-billion institutional capital allocated across the funds she helped manage at Meridian Crest. Her personal exposure through Hale Microsystems represented close to 2/3 of her own capital. Yes, it was a concentrated position, but she had stress-tested the projections. With operational reform and proper capitalization, the company could realistically approach a valuation exceeding $1.5 billion within several years. Martin was slowly nodding as he reviewed the projections again. If anything, the assumptions were conservative, especially if they secured the aerospace supplier agreement referenced in her analysis. Veronica looked up sharply. What agreement? The one Olivia had been negotiating quietly for several months. A private aerospace systems contractor was seeking a specialized electronics partner for a new satellite communications platform. Hale Microsystems had the technical capability, but lacked the production capacity to fulfill the scale required. With the new capital structure, expansion would become possible. The potential agreement represented several $100 million over multiple years, with extension options. Silence returned. Daniel had stopped pacing. Veronica's fingers tightened along the edge of the table. Finally, she asked the question that wasn't about money. Why? If Olivia had all this success, all this leverage, why intervene at all? She could have waited. She could have allowed collapse. She could have acquired the remains later at a fraction of the cost. Olivia answered quietly. Because despite everything, it was still the company they created. Because hundreds of people depended on those paychecks. Because the underlying technology still had value. Because the market still had opportunity. And because she needed to prove something. Daniel frowned. Prove what? That she understood business. The words settled heavily between them. She saw the color rise in her father's face. Saw her mother look down instead of responding. Edward finally broke the silence. Perhaps a short recess would be appropriate. Time to process the information before proceeding to a formal vote. The directors began filing out quietly. Most avoided looking directly at Daniel and Veronica. Martin left his screen active, financial disclosures still visible. Edward paused near the exit. Olivia, may I have a word? She followed him into the corridor, leaving her parents alone across the long conference table. That was harsh, Edward said quietly once the door closed. Necessary, she replied. You could have approached them privately. She had tried. Months earlier, she had called Daniel and asked to review the company's financial direction together. He had told her to concentrate on her own career and leave corporate matters to experienced leadership. They were never going to listen without pressure. Edward nodded slowly. The restructuring framework is strong, and the proposed CEO candidate is highly respected. But he warned her this would almost certainly fracture what remained of her relationship with her parents. Olivia gave a small, humorless smile. What relationship? The one where every idea she offered was dismissed, where every accomplishment was minimized, where she was still treated like someone who didn't understand reality. They are proud of what they built, Edward said carefully. This company has defined their lives. She knew. and she was trying to make sure it continued to exist. But markets evolve, technology evolves, leadership had to evolve too. They had refused. So now she was forcing adaptation. Edward studied her for a long moment. When she had first approached him about purchasing his position, he had nearly declined. He had assumed she lacked experience. Then he reviewed her performance history, the companies she selected, the returns she generated. She had an instinct many professionals spent entire careers trying to develop. She answered quietly that her parents had taught her more than they realized. They had taught her manufacturing discipline, process efficiency, quality evaluation, risk awareness. She had simply applied those lessons to capital allocation instead of production lines. Edward allowed himself a small smile. There was irony there. They stood silently for a moment, watching through the glass as Daniel and Veronica sat far apart at the table, neither speaking. They will resist this, Edward warned. They will explore every legal argument available. She expected that, which was why every filing had been precise, every acquisition independent, every disclosure compliant. Even the most aggressive attorneys would find nothing actionable. You planned this carefully, Edward said. More than a year, she confirmed. Since the first time she fully understood how serious the deterioration had become. Edward exhaled slowly. Your parents are exceptional engineers, visionary even. But leadership requires different skills, and recognizing when help is needed is often the hardest one. That was why the restructuring placed experienced operators in executive control, people who understood scale, supply chains, growth management. Her parents could focus on engineering and product innovation, where their strengths actually were. Do you think they'll accept that? Edward asked. They may not have a choice. She controlled the majority voting power. That's not what I meant. She sighed slightly. No, probably not immediately. But perhaps when stability returned, when growth resumed, they might understand. And if they never did, at least hundreds of people would remain employed, and a viable company would not disappear because of pride. The 15-minute recess extended longer, 20, then nearly half an hour. Finally, Edward suggested returning. The directors gradually returned to their seats. Daniel and Veronica entered last, sitting side by side now, presenting a unified position. Edward called the session back to order. A formal proposal remained under consideration, involving a major capital investment from Meridian Crest Capital in exchange for convertible financing and governance restructuring. By the time the meeting resumed, the atmosphere had changed. This was no longer a discussion about strategy. It had become a confrontation about legacy. Edward looked around the table and suggested they open the floor for final discussion before the vote. Daniel stood. He had recovered some of his composure. His voice carried that controlled, formal tone he always used when he believed he was defending something important. What Olivia has done today may be technically legal, he began, but legality and ethics are not the same thing. He said she had used her proximity to them, her understanding of their weaknesses, their trust, to quietly position herself for control of the very company her parents had spent more than 20 years building. Olivia tried to respond, but he raised a hand. He wasn't finished. She had sat at their table, lived under their roof at different points in her life, shared family holidays, all while silently accumulating ownership, waiting, positioning herself for the moment they were most exposed. And now she expected them to accept becoming minority stakeholders in their own creation, to step aside while outside leadership took control. The proposed CEO was not an outsider, Olivia answered calmly once he finished. She was one of the most respected operational leaders in the sector. She had previously scaled a mid-size engineering firm from modest revenue to several $100 million within less than a decade. She's not us, Veronica said quietly. She doesn't understand what we've built here, the culture, the values. With respect, Martin said carefully, those values would not matter if the company ceased to exist within a matter of weeks. Veronica turned toward him sharply. And whose side are you on? He answered without hesitation. On the side of the employees whose livelihoods depended on stability. On the side of the retirement plans tied to the company. On the side of survival. And right now, Olivia's proposal was the only realistic path forward. That's not accurate, Daniel argued. There were other possibilities. There was one other proposal, Edward corrected. An industrial buyer had expressed interest in acquiring selected assets during insolvency proceedings. The offer would cover only a fraction of current obligations, a small transition team might remain temporarily. Production would eventually be relocated overseas. Most of the workforce would be released. There must be alternatives, Veronica insisted. Olivia answered quietly that she had already looked. For months, she had spoken with potential strategic partners, private investment groups, advisory firms. The market for specialized electronics manufacturers had become extremely unforgiving. They were competing against firms with lower production costs, faster innovation cycles, greater capital reserves. The only reason Meridian Crest was willing to participate was because she was committing her own capital alongside the fund, and because she had already secured a conditional supply agreement dependent on restructuring. Daniel looked at her differently then. For the first time, his voice showed strain. "You should have come to us." She answered that she had tried. Months earlier, she had warned him the financial trajectory was dangerous. He had told her to focus on her own career and leave corporate matters to experienced leadership. That was different, he insisted. She asked how. How had it been different? She had tried to offer analysis, tried to identify risks, tried to point out operational gaps. Each time she had been dismissed, just as she had been dismissed most of her life whenever she spoke about finance, markets, or strategy. "That's not fair," Veronica said. Olivia looked directly at her. Wasn't it? How many times had they described her education as impractical? How many times had her work been reduced to something small? How many dinners had ended with her being told to leave business discussions to people who understood them? The silence that followed carried years of things never said. She finally admitted she never wanted it to happen like this. She had wanted to help. She had wanted to use what she had built to protect what they had built. But they had never been able to see her as anything other than their daughter, who didn't understand the real world. Daniel repeated her age again, but now without conviction. She answered not with emotion, but with facts. She had responsibility for hundreds of millions in managed capital. She had helped grow multiple companies. She had identified the opportunity they overlooked. She had assembled the only viable recovery structure on the table. At what point, she asked quietly, did experience begin to matter more than age? No one answered. Edward cleared his throat. It was time to vote. All those in favor of accepting the Meridian Crest restructuring proposal. Olivia raised her hand immediately. Edward followed. Martin, several other directors, a clear majority, opposed. Daniel and Veronica raised their hands together. Two longtime allies joined them. The numbers were not enough. Edward announced the motion approved. Daniel stood abruptly. He said they would challenge the decision, that they would find legal grounds, that they would prove improper influence or misuse of internal knowledge. Martin answered quietly that every acquisition had been documented, every disclosure compliant, every transaction reviewed. The structure was clean. The best legal teams available would not change that. Veronica was still looking at Olivia. Her expression was no longer just anger. There was something else there now, something much harder to define. The victory did not feel like victory. It felt like loss, hurt, anger, and something else she couldn't quite name. There was one final matter to address, Edward said, his voice steady as he reviewed the remaining agenda. Olivia had requested the opportunity to speak to the entire company staff the following morning. She intended to explain the restructuring and answer questions directly. Given her position as controlling shareholder, he believed it was appropriate. Absolutely not, Daniel said immediately. Those were their employees. Olivia answered gently that they were the company's employees, and they deserved clarity from someone who could honestly address their concerns about stability and the future. Veronica stood slowly, gathering her documents. This was wrong, she said quietly. What Olivia had done that day was not just business. In her eyes, it had come at the cost of family. She said Olivia had chosen control over loyalty. Olivia answered just as quietly that she had chosen survival, whether they accepted that or not. Her parents left without another word. The remaining directors exited more slowly. Some offered brief congratulations. Others avoided her entirely. Eventually, only Edward, Martin, and Olivia remained. Martin finally exhaled. In decades of corporate finance, he admitted he had never witnessed a meeting quite like that one. Edward answered that it had been unavoidable. Daniel and Veronica would have resisted change until nothing remained. Martin asked whether they would recover from it, not as executives, as people. Olivia considered the question longer than she expected. She admitted she didn't know. Perhaps time would soften it. Or perhaps they would never forgive her for forcing reality into the open. Edward said that sometimes the correct decision was rarely the comfortable one. Olivia closed her laptop and gathered her notes. She needed to prepare for the staff meeting. There would be difficult questions. As she reached the door, Martin asked about the aerospace supply agreement. Was it truly secure? She allowed herself a small smile. There was a preliminary commitment from the contractor's procurement leadership. Legal teams were finalizing language. Formal signatures were expected within several weeks. Martin said that if she succeeded, the company would not merely survive, it would transform. From a declining manufacturer into a strategic supplier within a rapidly expanding industry. She answered that was the objective. Her parents had taught her to think ambitiously. They simply never expected her ambition to extend beyond theirs. She left the building as evening light stretched across the nearly empty parking area. Her phone was already filling with messages. Her team at Meridian Crest wanted updates. The incoming CEO wanted to coordinate transition steps. Legal counsel wanted confirmation that governance filings were complete. There was nothing from her parents. She sat in her car for a long time looking at the Hale Microsystems building. More than 2 decades of their lives. Years of innovation. Years of struggle. Years of success. And then the refusal to change when change became necessary. Now responsibility had shifted to her. Her phone vibrated again. A message from Edward. Staff meeting confirmed for the morning. Main conference hall. Nearly 200 employees expected. Many anxious. Be prepared. She responded simply. She was ready. And she was. She had spent more than a year positioning herself for this moment. Months securing the conditional supply agreement. Endless hours studying every detail of the business. She now understood the company as deeply as anyone. Every production process. Every efficiency metric. Every financial pressure point. What she had not prepared for was the emptiness she felt remembering her mother's expression when she left the room. Or the moment her father's voice had faltered when he asked why she hadn't trusted them. She had tried, more than once. Every attempt had ended the same way. Dismissal, polite condescension, the quiet certainty that she did not understand how business really worked. Now they knew she did. The only question left was whether they would ever understand why she had done it. She started the engine and drove away from Hale Microsystems, away from the building that had defined her parents' lives. The company now controlled by the daughter they believed couldn't read a financial statement. The next day, she would stand before nearly 200 anxious employees and explain how their jobs would be protected. She would outline the recovery plan, confirm the new strategic contract, introduce the incoming chief executive. And somewhere in the back of the room, she suspected her parents might be watching their daughter. The one they believed too inexperienced, the one with the small career, the one who was supposed to leave serious decisions to others. Explain how she had protected everything they built. Whether they would ever thank her or resent her remained unknown. But the company would survive. The livelihoods would remain intact. And that would have to be enough. Even if it meant the people she had tried hardest to impress might never speak to her again.